Okay. Great. Good morning, Courtney, or good evening, good night, whatever.
Good morning. Great to be with you all.
Getting so much just on her.
Go down to the bar.
Sorry, hold on one sec. We're just trying to get, so you're the only one on the screen.
Go to view. Top right,
Oh, you're up here again, okay.
and then speaker.
Okay, great. All right, well, Courtney, thank you so much for joining us today to kind of talk to us about the latest and greatest going on in DC and how that impacting tax policies and so forth. I think might be great if you could start off by just giving us an update on what Congress is scheduled to vote on, I think today, and then,
Yep.
and the rest of the week.
Yep. Yeah. So let me share my screen first. But so there's certainly a lot going on in Washington right now. I'm still waiting for a slow August. I was promised that when I started at Strategas 7 years ago, and I still have not been able to see what that looks like. But we're essentially setting up right now for Congress to vote on the kind of first steps of the reconciliation process to get President Biden's fiscal agenda in line. And I think kind of maybe if I can set the stage a little bit for what Washington currently looks at and what's at stake for this week. So essentially, when Biden was inaugurated on January 20th, we kind of saw him as having three real mandates to crush COVID-19, to turn down the volume in Washington, and to not hurt the economy. And it's not just in the month of August. This has been kind of going on for several months now. But we've essentially seen, COVID-19 resurge, the border crisis. The bottom chart on the left shows in the red what the fiscal year 2021 border crossings look like, inflation concerns, and then certainly the situation in Afghanistan. And so what we have kind of teed up for this week is potentially something that could devastate President Biden's fiscal agenda, which is what the administration and Democratic leadership are trying to kind of change the narrative on and push through to take away from kind of where President Biden's issues have come with his mandate in the last several weeks to months. So if you're not familiar, if you've missed Infrastructure Week for the last several weeks, the Senate passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill earlier this month, and then they passed the reconciliation instruction with the budget to do the full reconciliation bill later this year. What the House has lined up and what the House is voting on today are procedurally tonight 3 bills. So they're voting on the budget resolution, they're voting on the bipartisan bill, and then they're voting on a Voting Rights Act. And essentially the votes today are just to start debate. These are not real votes. Tomorrow, they're going to be voting on the actual voting rights bill and then the actual budget resolution to be able to start the reconciliation debate. Moderate Democrats are posing a problem to Speaker Pelosi and President Biden, in so much as they're saying that they don't want to start the voting on the reconciliation process without voting on the bipartisan infrastructure bill, because they think, let's just get President Biden to win. Let's just do this bipartisan infrastructure bill first. The issue, though, if they were to do the bipartisan infrastructure bill first, though, in Speaker Pelosi's view, is that she loses her leverage, because these moderate Democrats, they like everything that's in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. They might not essentially like everything that's in the reconciliation bill, and she risks potentially not being able to get that reconciliation bill through. She also could run into issues if progressive Democrats refuse to vote for the reconciliation bill, and she doesn't get enough Republicans on board, and then the vote could fail in that way. So she's really holding the line, saying that she's not going to change her order. Reconciliation bill goes first, and then once the reconciliation bill passes, then they can work on passing the bipartisan bill. What she has done, which I think is really incremental over the last couple of days, is change the timeline. So typically it takes 60 days from the time that a budget resolution passes to when you actually get that reconciliation bill passed. So we were thinking kind of at earliest mid-October for seeing this reconciliation bill pass. she's saying that she thinks that she can get both bills passed by the end of September. That is extremely, extremely aggressive on her timing. But there's a few reasons why she's saying that. First reason she's saying that is because she's trying to appease those moderate Democrats. She's saying highway trust fund funding doesn't expire until the end of September. There's no rush to pass this bipartisan bill. It'll still be passed by the time that we need to pass it for highway trust fund funding. Makes sense. The second reason she's saying this is because there's a couple other things going on that Washington has to deal with. Continuing government funding would be one of those. Government would shut down October 1st if they don't continue government funding. And then the other one is the debt ceiling. So highly unlikely that Congress is going to be able to pass the appropriation bills by the end of September. They're going to need to do some type of continuing resolution, kind of just kick the can down the road until November or December on government funding. And then the debt ceiling X date, probably seeing that around October. Democrats refused to put that in the reconciliation instruction, so now they need 10 Republican votes. Minority Leader McConnell has been clear he's not going to supply 10 Republican votes, but if they put the debt ceiling, continuing resolution, and bipartisan infrastructure bill into a single package, very much increase the odds that you can get the 10 Republican votes for that, because the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed with 69 votes, so 19 Republicans voting for it. So this week is setting the stage for the next several weeks. It's really, in our view, going to be a fall to remember in terms of the fiscal policy agenda. A lot of things could hamper that agenda, but this week we're basically setting up for the House starting the process on the reconciliation bill, saying that they're going to have their drafts done by September 15th and then pass that legislation by the end of September.
Great. Thank you. And so, what kind of odds are you guys placing on, these various pieces getting through in sort of the format that the Democratic leadership is asking for, pushing for? And then, with that said, what are the tax policy implications, inside of these, especially if, $3.5 trillion for reconciliation and so forth?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the situation in Afghanistan and everything else that's happened over the last few weeks, we've been getting a lot of questions in terms of, does this decrease the odds that something is going to happen? Does this mean that we're not going to get tax increases because there's going to be, more concerns about passing things that are potentially, politically difficult for moderate Democrats, and they just want to get kind of all the candy, all the spending, without any of the spinach or the tax increases. In our view, what's really changed with the Afghanistan situation is timing. They're speeding this up. And then directionally, and we had already been moving in this direction with moderate Democrats, you're kind of moving in the direction of potentially having a smaller spending package and smaller tax increases. So they can do up to $3.5 trillion of spending and have a deficit impact over the 10-year budget window of $1.7 trillion. Potentially we only see $2.5 to $3 trillion of spending, and potentially we see tax increases, looking sub 1.5 trillion on that instead of up to 1.7 trillion. We could see $1.2 trillion of tax increases. But our odds of this actually going through, our odds of having this bipartisan package with a reconciliation instruction. So doing both packages, those are 40%. We're relatively confident that they're going to be able to get this done. And the odds that we get nothing done are 15%. So because the failure is not really an option here with Democrats. They see what's going on currently. This is Biden's fiscal agenda. This is his legacy potentially and his presidency. And going into the midterm elections in November, highly likely that Democrats are going to lose the House. This is really the last bite at the apple, potentially, for Democrats to get any of their legislation done. So very important to them. We really think that, potentially you have things fall apart where you only get the bipartisan deal or you only get the reconciliation bill. But our base case is that both of these bills are going to get done and that they're trying to really speed up the timing, and they're probably going to push even harder to make sure they get done, given the situation that's going on with Afghanistan and COVID and inflation and Biden's political capital waning. what I would say on taxes, if I can speed through some of these. So I'll actually start with, I'll start with the individual tax increases. So there's no tax increases in the bipartisan package, just to make that clear. So bipartisan package, that's funded through reutilizing COVID-19 funding, spectrum sales, the now infamous cryptocurrency tax. There's no individual or corporate tax increases in that first bipartisan infrastructure bill. Everything is in this reconciliation $3.5 trillion bill. So in terms of tax increases on the individual side, we are anticipating that the top marginal rate is going to increase from 37% to 39.6%. And we are probably going to see some type of net investment tax on businesses or the removal of the 20% tax deduction on small businesses. They are targeting small businesses, which is a little bit surprising in this legislation. But you could potentially see the 3.8% net investment tax imposed on small businesses with earnings over 400,000. We do anticipate, because there are concerns from moderate Democrats who have basically said that they won't vote for this package if it's not included, we anticipate some type of SALT reimplementation. They might not be able to do the full reimplementation because it costs $90 billion per year. So even though they only have to do it through 2025, because the individual provisions expire from CCGA at the end of 2025, it is pretty expensive. So we could see a partial reinstatement of SALT, but there will be some type of reinstatement of SALT in this package. For the individual income and the small business tax increases, we anticipate those will be effective for calendar year 2022. Certainly there was some concern about those potentially being retroactive or those being partial year tax increases. The fact that we're talking about realistically fourth quarter for when this is going to be passed, we're looking at calendar year 2022, January 1st effective date. On capital gains, we're not anticipating that the capital gains rate is going to reach parity with the individual income tax rate. Most studies essentially show that the revenue maximizing rate for the capital gains tax is 28%, because you can choose when you want to realize your capital gains. So a higher tax rate, people just tend to hold on to those longer. So pretty much every study aside from, I think, one I've seen, just 28% of the revenue maximizing rate. So we anticipate that's going to be the rate they go with. Still see the 3.8% net investment tax. On top of that, though, the effective date for capital gains is really the only tax on the individual and corporate side where we see that being effective around the date of enactment. So around the date of signage, they're probably going to make that capital gains tax effective because they don't want people front running it. What you could see is it be slightly even more retroactive. So September 15th is the date that they have in the Senate and the House to have their committee work done. So what they could do is they could make the capital gains tax retroactive to September 15th. Probably going to see some headlines in the next couple of weeks about even more retroactivity on that. But realistically, in our view, we're looking at September 15th. Some of the other proposals that have been talked about kind of in that realm, carried interest removal is something that we always hear about. Every cycle it comes up. It came up in 2017 where President Trump wanted to get rid of carried interest. We don't anticipate that's actually going to go through just because it's primarily real estate that's affected. Every single congressional district has real estate in it. So we're not anticipating they're going to actually be able to get rid of carried interest. It's also not hugely revenue raising. So there's not a huge motivation there. Similarly, Biden's proposed removing 1031 like-kind exchanges. Again, real estate, not anticipating that that's actually going to happen. On the estate tax front, where we have been getting a lot of questions, particularly after the Treasury document came out, and initially no one saw the word estate tax and everyone thought it was great. And then you read the document and it called for ending step up in basis for gains in excess of $1 million. And it was essentially a tax on unrealized gains, effective upon transfer. The estate tax is probably one of the most sensitive individual tax increases in Washington because it affects farms, it affects small businesses. It's not as partisan of an issue as a lot of these other tax increases. Again, they can't afford to lose a single Democrat on this, and Senators Sinema and Manchin have both voted to outright repeal the estate tax. So you'd be asking two Democrats who voted to get rid of a tax entirely to make it extremely more onerous. That being said, President Biden really believes in this stuff. So in 1976, Congress got rid of step-up in basis on inherited property, and they made it carryover basis. Change was pretty quickly suspended, and they outright repealed it in 1979. But there were only 4 senators who voted against repealing it, and then Senator Biden was one of them. So this is something that he very much cares about, but given how politically sensitive it is, we don't anticipate the changes that President Biden has proposed will go into effect. What we could see, and again, this is a more difficult tax than just raising the top marginal income tax rate, is increasing the tax rate from 40% to 45%, and some attempt at the exemption levels. The exemption levels will be interesting to see how that plays out because again, TCGI, individual tax increases, those expire after 2025. So they could potentially make a case for moderate Democrats of saying if they get an exemption rate somewhere between 6 million and 11 million, and they make that permanent, that they have gotten a permanently higher exemption rate, even though it's lower than the current exemption rate. Probably going to see how that ends up scoring because they're going to be looking for revenue on this. And if they do something permanent like that, it's not going to score very well. But that is a way to get your moderate Democrats like Sinema, like Manchin, who have voted to outright repeal something, more on board because you're giving them a permanently better exemption level than what we're going to be reverting back to after the individual income tax provisions expire from TCGA. I can go on to corporate, Jim, or do you want me to redirect somewhere else?
I have a couple questions on that, on those various individual taxes. So as negotiations begin, are we more likely to see kind of pushback from the Republicans on specific taxes, and that, you know, if we see a package of taxes go through, we're definitely going to get this tax, but maybe this tax will not be touched? Or is the approach more like, okay, all of these taxes are going to get increased, let's try to keep the increases, you know, to a minimum? Or are they going to say, you know, fine, we'll let them raise, you know, the estate tax here, but we're really going to push hard to not get an increase in, you know, capital gains tax?
Yeah, so if I were to rank these in terms of likelihood, individuals the easiest. So raising that top marginal rate back to 39.6%, that's the absolute easiest for them to do. Capital gains, if Biden was really pushing hard on making that parity, that would be very difficult for them to do. You've seen a number of the more moderate Democrats say that they don't want parity with the individual rates, but pretty much it's not that controversial from Democrats to do a higher capital gains rate, especially because you're talking about provisions that are more related and directed towards the wealthy. There's going to be pushback from Republicans, but that pushback is going to be manageable for Democrats, especially if they're making the rate less than the top individual income tax rate. 28% is the revenue maximizing rate. Again, they're going to face pushback for all these things, but that's manageable for your more moderate Democrats. And those Democrats who said that they didn't want parity with the individual rate still said that they favored a higher capital gains tax rate. And that kind of goes towards the, you know, Senators Warren, Senator Sanders standpoint of trying to make this not just a revenue raiser, but also social policy of, you know, equalizing wealth. The issue they're going to run into trouble with is the estate tax. Just because that is, you know, you're talking about things that are affecting farms, you're talking about things that are affecting small businesses. The Biden administration, with their initial plan, had wanted to figure out ways to exempt small businesses and farms. From our conversations with staffers, they have continuously tried to find ways to make the estate tax less onerous for small businesses and farms. It's just not really feasible. So that's really where, in terms of the individual tax increases, that's going to be the most difficult for them to do. We still put 70% odds of them being able to raise the rate and do something with the exemption level. But that's going to be where the most pushback, I would say, from Republicans is going to come. They could face pushback if they don't do things like carried interest, because, you know, that's something that Senator Schumer with New York has in the past tried to protect, and it is something that obviously benefits the wealthy more. So Republicans could potentially attack them for doing something on the estate tax and not doing something with carried interest. But that's more of a math equation. And again, they're going to be trying to protect real estate in all of their districts.
Okay, thank you. At the outset, you mentioned that there were no tax increases in the bipartisan bill. I mean, is it realistic that all the spending for that can be, redirected from COVID and so forth? Or is that one of those kind of Washington hope fors that, oh yeah, there's money here, we'll do more audits and get more people, to pay their taxes, and oh, there's Medicare waste and we can find all this money, but in reality, they're going to have to increase taxes, or can they really pay for that whole bill without tax increases?
So they don't end up paying for the whole bill without tax increases. It does raise the deficit a little bit shy of $300 billion over the 10-year window. It is deficit increasing. But they are, so when you look at something that passes through regular order, the bipartisan package, there's 60 votes in the Senate, there's less restrictions on that type of a package. You can raise, the budget window is 10 years, but they can have a deficit impact after those 10 years. They're not really constrained. If they didn't want to pay for that package at all, they don't have to pay for that package at all. With reconciliation, because they're doing it with 51 votes and because of the rules around reconciliation, they can't break that reconciliation instruction. So they have said that 1.7 trillion of it over the 10-year budget window can increase the deficit. They could have made that 10 trillion. There's really no limit on what you could say for the deficit impact over the budget window. They chose 1.7. They're now bound to 1.7. So they need to make sure that they're finding some type of pay for any spending that they're doing over $1.7 trillion. And they can't increase the deficit after the 10-year budget window. So what you might see with the reconciliation package is some of those spending provisions are only for 5, 6, 7 years, but the tax provisions are permanent or at least 10 years because they're trying to make sure that the tax provisions go on longer than the spending provisions to make sure they're not breaking that budget window with the reconciliation rule. For the bipartisan packages, going back to the bipartisan package, so what they're doing is really repurposing a lot of COVID-19 relief. There's a lot of it is COVID-19 relief. So there's $205 billion of COVID relief funds. And then there's an additional about, I think, 100 or 150 billion in unemployment benefit repurposing. And then they're doing spectrum sales. They're selling oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. They're really looking very thoroughly at their pay for options. What they ended up doing, though, is excluding those IRS provisions in the bipartisan package because Republicans started to come out in opposition of them because they were expanding the IRS. And there's still some bad will with Republicans towards the IRS, given how conservative groups were treated. So the IRS provisions are now actually in the reconciliation provision. So on my screen here, see that they're anticipating those would raise almost $720 billion. Highly unlikely that those raise $720 billion. But that's what they're going with in terms of kind of the Biden budget. When CBO and JCT actually score this, that number is going to come down pretty dramatically of what they could get from IRS reporting. But that's not in the bipartisan bill. The bipartisan bill is only COVID-19 repurposing, spectrum sales, some changes to Medicare rebate rules, and selling oil from the SPR, things along those lines. Really small, a number of very small provisions.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate you kind of spell out all the potential tax increases on the individual side. Can you talk a little bit about the corporate rate, and are there any sort of surprise taxes that might pop up during this, negotiation process?
Yeah, so on the corporate, there's two big measures that they're looking at for the pay first here. So the first one is increasing the rate. So on this chart, that $800 billion from the corporate tax rate increase, that's assuming the rate would go up to 28%. We think that the rate is realistically 25%. That's where it seems like everyone is. Senator Manchin, I feel like every week tries to make headlines saying that he's at a 25% rate. He's been at 25% since the TCGA debates in 2017, has not changed his position on that. So 25% rate is what we're anticipating for corporate, again, effective January 1st of 2022. The other big provision, which I don't think is getting enough attention, is on multinationals. So the Biden administration proposed raising the GILTI tax, so it's the tax on intangible foreign sourced income on US multinationals from 10.5% to 21%. Realistically, our view is we're looking at probably raising that to 18%. And then the Biden administration also proposed, in addition to raising that rate, imposing it on a country by country basis. So instead of being able to aggregate your foreign intangible income and say, oh, I paid a high tax rate in Japan, I paid a low tax rate in Ireland, it averages it out and kind of being able to buffer the tax a little bit, they would make you pay that tax specifically on your Ireland income. So you couldn't use the higher tax rate that you paid in Japan as a buffer. Our view is that they're going to end up grouping countries by low tax and high tax just because it's too onerous to do it on a country by country basis. But you know, that certainly gives companies a little bit of relief, but certainly a large change there. And the Biden administration also proposed changing the QBAI, which is basically the physical property exemption on GILTI, which makes it a tax on intangible income, and entirely getting rid of it. So it'd just be a complete tax on your foreign source income. We anticipate that QBAI exemption will actually remain in place. And overall, our view is that the corporate tax rate increases that we're realistically looking at, so that 25% tax, that 18% GILTI rate, those are going to cut anticipated S&P 500 earnings growth from next year from 9.2% to 3.7%. So it's pretty significant. And a lot of it is on the international side. I don't think that's getting enough attention. It really impacts your healthcare companies and your tech companies who have a lot of foreign sourced income. We did a screen for tax losers, and essentially our top sub-industries were semiconductors, semiconductor equipment, certainly not industries the Biden administration would really want to be targeting in this type of environment, and then life sciences tools and biotech companies that have a lot of foreign source income and are potentially in really low tax jurisdictions. The international provisions in here are incredibly onerous. And what the Biden administration potentially did, which was a mistake, is they tied these international tax provisions to how negotiations are going to go at the OECD, which we're going to be seeing more in October, where Secretary Yellen was pushing for that 15% minimum global tax rate at the OECD as a way to kind of buffer the fact that Biden wanted a higher GILTI tax rate on US multinationals, as a way to not disadvantage US companies. If Secretary Yellen can't get that 15% minimum tax rate, or there's too many exemptions in it, that could force some of those moderate Democrats to be a little bit concerned about how harmful this is to US companies, especially because we are going into a midterm election year. Does that change the provisions? Does that make them want to delay it by a year until after the midterm elections? Does that make them want to phase that in? Those are all kind of unknown questions at this point until we get to those OECD talks. But potentially they're going to be in a hard spot if those OECD negotiations don't go well. And the other aspect of the OECD negotiations, the excess profit tax, which is replacing the digital services tax, that requires a treaty to get approved. So that's certainly going to take a long time and will not get through a Republican Congress. So they're potentially really hurt themselves by tying their international tax provisions to the OECD. But again, base case here, 25% corporate tax, and then a 18% GILTI rate. I think that this is interesting if I could just show this slide. So we go through companies' lobbying disclosures, and any given year, companies are lobbying on tax issues, but we have seen an uptick in companies lobbying on corporate and international issues. So over half of the S&P 500 is lobbying on a tax issue. Over 20% of them are lobbying specifically on corporate tax issues. They're specifically lobbying to keep the corporate tax rate 21%, or they're specifically lobbying, if you look at the international, again, over 20%, specifically lobbying on the GILTI tax rate issue. There's going to be a massive lobbying effort over the next couple of weeks from companies to try to get what they want out of the tax discussions. And again, it's really affecting, in our view, at least on the international side, the healthcare and the tech space. On the domestic side, you are looking more at consumer stocks and communications. But when we talk to companies, it seems like they can handle the 21% to the 25% corporate tax increase. It's those international changes that a lot of these companies are a lot more concerned about. because they could disadvantage them so much relative to competitors.
Great, thank you. You know, you've touched on it a couple of times in the midterm elections. You know, how are you handicapping the midterms, you know, that the House and or the Senate flips? And is that, I know it change based on how big these, you know, tax proposals are and what might get through?
Yeah, so we're going to get two good indicators with the California recall and the California recall is September 14th, and the Virginia gubernatorial election is November 2nd. So if Republicans do well in either of those, there's a pretty good indications going into the midterms, and potentially the California gubernatorial could again spook some of those moderate Democrats in terms of the reconciliation package. Our base case at this point is that Republicans are going to take the House. So that chart on the right there shows, you know, on average, a new president's party loses almost 30 seats in their first midterm election. You know, that has nothing to do with the fiscal agenda. The only president who has won seats in their first midterm election was President Bush, and that was following 9/11, and he also had a 62% approval rating on election day. So a little bit different dynamic than what you typically see for a new president going into the first midterm election. Republicans, again, only need to win a net 5 seats. So, you know, net 5 seats on average, it's 29.6 seats. They're in pretty good shape going into the midterms, and they get an added boost because of redistricting. So Democrats are going to be disadvantaged with the redistricting process. There's also, again, we're over a year away, but there have already been 16 House members who have said that they're not going to be running for re-election. 8 of those are Republicans, 8 of those are Democrats. Only 1 Republican is in a district that's less than 10% more Republican than the country as a whole. That's Lee Zeldin in New York. His district is only 9.6% more Republican than the country as a whole. But if you look at the 8 Democrats, 4 of them are in districts where they're more Republican leaning than the country as a whole. So those districts are in Illinois, Pennsylvania, Florida, and Ohio. And those are Democrats that are retiring for a variety of reasons, or not running again for a variety of reasons. There's some retirements. Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania is running for governor. So it's not just that they think that they're going to lose, but that's going to be more difficult for Democrats to defend open seats that are in more Republican-leaning districts than the country as a whole. So base case, House Republicans are going to take it at this point. Just because the House is likely to do poorly doesn't automatically mean that the Senate is going to flip as well. We've had scenarios before where a party has lost seats in the House and gained seats in the Senate. 2018 is a good example of that, where the GOP lost a net 40 seats in the House and it picked up 2 Senate seats. But that was a different map, a different situation. Democrats going into 2022 are defending 14 seats. Republicans are defending 20, but you have Democrats having to defend Warnock's seat in Georgia, as you all know, and then they also have to defend Arizona, Senator Kelly's seat, because those were both special elections. Those are going to be tough for them to defend. On the other side, Republicans have a lot of retirements on their end when you're looking at seats like Pennsylvania and Ohio. So the Senate's harder for us to handicap at this point. Betting odds are indicating Republicans are going to take the Senate as well. I think it's a little bit too early. I think that's an issue where it's really going to depend on how voters perceive the fiscal agenda going forward. That's kind of where Democrats are concerned. If they have a situation where they're doing these massive packages, inflation is increasing, spending though from infrastructure like packages like these typically takes a year to come out. So a good chance you're not really going to feel the spending benefits. But the tax policies are going to be felt immediately. So they're concerned about the fact that they could be hit by Republicans going into the midterms of all these tax increases are going to be felt potentially in the economy, and inflation is still increasing, but they're not going to get these spending benefits. So that's really going to depend on how the fiscal policy packages are perceived.
Hey, Courtney, could I direct you, and I don't want to get you off on, looking into the future, but there are a few questions that I have going back to some of the individual tax increases.
Mm-hmm.
let me know when it would be good for you to go into that. There's more nuance, but some that I know we're getting a lot of questions from clients trying to do planning right now.
Yeah, happy to take those.
Okay, so on the estate side, if I heard you right, your base case is that likely, if there is a change in estate law, it would be more to rate increases and potentially exemption reductions, less likely to, the more onerous carryover basis issues. When Bernie's outline came out earlier this year, every planner had heartburn because the most simplistic ways to reduce asset value in estates were going to be ripped away. There was concerns about elimination of family limited partnerships, GRATs, almost every go-to technique. If we're back into more of a state regime and not tackling carryover basis, are any of those popular techniques back in the forefront of potentially being eliminated or reduced for future use?
So we haven't seen discussion on that at this point. We've really only seen it, and I wouldn't even say we've seen a lot of talk about it. We haven't seen a lot of talk about the estate tax, I would say, from like the more moderate members and more detailed to begin with. But again, estate tax is really difficult to make changes to. The least onerous way they could do it is just simply changing the exemption level and raising the rate. And that's really our base case. At this point, we're not anticipating them to really try to make any changes to the details and to the ways that you can potentially avoid some of the more onerous aspects of the estate tax. We'll be getting more detail. Again, they're trying to have their committees have the drafts done by September 15th. So come September 15th, when the Senate Finance Committee releases their proposals, we'll have a better idea of what they're planning. But at this point, we're just anticipating increase in the rate and potential change to the exemption level.
Okay. And then going back to the small business deduction, because it is surprising that that's not getting a lot more headlines. Would you say that if your base case for the corporate rate is up to 25%, would you assume that a small business tax reduction would be in parity, or would you think that there's a possibility that they could somehow eliminate the small business deduction with still increasing the corporate rate?
So our base case on the small business, and this is just based off of what they've proposed so far, there hasn't really been a conversation about the parity aspect. There was a lot of concern, I would say, after the general election, that because President Biden kept saying that he wanted to reverse TCJA, that they were talking about removing the 20% small business exemption. That has not been clearly put off the table by anyone, but it seems like they're more moving in the direction of retaining that 20% exemption and just putting on that 3.8% net investment tax for small businesses or for individuals with earnings over 400,000. And their argument for doing that is because based off of studies and the Tax Foundation, which is conservative leaning, backed up this idea of the study, is that should only realistically affect, I believe it was either 4% or 6% of small businesses in total. Now, what the Tax Foundation did is they showed that 6% of small businesses are 50% of the revenues of small businesses. So you shouldn't be looking at the number of small businesses, you should be looking at the revenues and the amount of money that you're impacting. But the Biden administration's argument and the way that they're trying to navigate what is, again, a more difficult tax increase, because you're talking about small business owners, is saying that what they're proposing is only impacting a very small segment of the small businesses, and it's impacting the more wealthy small businesses. So it goes in line with the, trying to make the wealthy pay their fair share aspect. So again, it looks like they're more leaning towards that 3.8% net investment tax and retaining the 20% deduction.
Okay, two more questions, and I promise to stop taking up time. The top rate gets a lot of discussion because it's more tangible, going back up to 39.6. But what is pretty impactful is just the shift across the board of all rates and the income targeting those rates. Any discussion about changes from our current structure and number of dollar amounts to hit the thresholds to get to next brackets versus what could happen? Are we looking at truly a potential $400,000 and then a pretty significant rate increase from that level, or using similar income targets and simply moving up more gradually?
Yeah, so it looks like what they're trying to do is do the 35% rate, having that cap out, I believe, at the 550 or whatever I can find the exact number that they had proposed, and then doing the 39.6% above that. So this is an area where we've been trying to get answers. I would say that we had a senior advisor to the Biden campaign, so not someone who's in the administration. We had a senior advisor to the Biden campaign speak for us for a conference call last year. And I used my moderator privilege to ask this question because it did not come up in the Q&A. But I asked the question about how they were actually thinking about the rates, and there was not an answer at that point. Now, they've had several months to figure that out, but this is, again, something that's probably going to the devil's going to be in the details. But it looks like what they would be trying to do is just kind of revert back to TCGA on the rates and not try to play around too much with trying to create an entirely new rate structure here.
So the impact of TCGA was really kind of detrimental to many of our clients. So even though rates came down, going back to SALT elimination, or capping SALT at $10,000 is a complete killer to many of our clients. Not, most of them are Southeast, Southwest. So income taxes weren't as significant as some states, but the property taxes were huge.
Yeah.
Can you just give a little bit more color of what your base case is for SALT if it is reinstated, how we could think about it potentially?
Yeah, so moderate Democrats, and I actually would think Schumer and Pelosi, being New York and California as well, would like to have a full reinstatement of SALT. And the benefit for them is they only have to pay for it through 2025, because then again, TCGA reverts. But it is just really expensive. It's $90 billion per year. So 4 years, $360 billion. That's an expensive thing to do when you're talking about only being able to have a $1.7 trillion deficit impact. What several studies have shown is if they were to do partial reinstatement, maybe allow for a deduction of up to $30,000, that only costs $30 billion per year. And if they were to make that more permanent, it would actually raise revenue after 2025, because instead of going to a full deduction, you're still limiting it. It's not clear based off of Biden's budget what they were looking for, because in Biden's budget, and go back here, the SALT number from Biden's budget is $150 billion. So if you're talking about, a $30,000 exemption costs $30 billion per year, that should be $120 billion. And that should actually be less than $120 billion because you're getting the revenue afterwards. But then full exemption is $360 billion. So I'm not sure what they put into the reconciliation package for why they're getting to $150 billion. I'm not sure what the math was on that. That could have just been them throwing a number and saying, we'll deal with this later. But full exemption looks like it's a little bit too costly, probably going to be something, looking at 30,000 or 40,000 of the limit there. I would say that there were concerns about them limiting it on an income basis. And there were some amendments put forward during the reconciliation kind of budget vote-a-rama for the budget, and those got thrown out. So it doesn't look like there's going to be any income caps on this. It's just going to be a matter of the actual cap on the amount.
Courtney, quick question on the heels of what Liz was asking. Going back to capital gains rates and the top rate currently being 20%. Hopefully it just goes to 25 to 28 as I think a lot of people, including you all, are thinking, versus say 40. But regardless, do you see the odds chance of it being retroactive being very high, or do you see it being implemented on a go-forward basis?
So our base case is that it's effective date. So our base case is that, the day that the legislation actually passes one of those chambers or signed into law is going to be the date that it's effective. But that I wouldn't say that that's an extremely confident base case. Maybe give that 55, 60% odds. So not a very confident call there. September 15th, if it is retroactive, would be the date. We are not anticipating it to be any more retroactive than September 15th. If you look at past capital gains tax increases, they haven't really been retroactive. So just doing September 15th would be a relatively new development. But I think, given the concerns about potential front running, and again, this is all going to be about scoring. If they don't make it somewhat retroactive or don't make it kind of an immediately effective date, that's not going to score as well because people are just going to take their gains and they don't want that. It's going to be all about maximizing revenue. So not entirely confident on our base case of effective date or a date of enactment, but September 15th looks like the worst case scenario versus April 30th or whatever was in some of the plans that have been released.
Okay, thank you.
Has there been any discussion about changing the annual gift exclusion to 15,000 per donee?
I haven't seen any discussion on that. I can double check, but that hasn't been something that we've seen at this point, and I don't believe that was in President Biden's budget proposal, and I don't think that that's in the reconciliation instruction as a directive either. So I don't think that's a top of mind issue for them at this point.
Thanks.
Courtney, you did a good job handicapping how you think the midterm elections are going to go. There's another body in DC that's not political, but the Fed, that has some leadership positions, coming up soon. How do you handicap the potential for, replacing the Fed chairman or other senior members of the Fed leadership?
Yeah, so certainly Secretary Yellen's comments over the weekend gave Powell a boost. We were, I think, a little bit, say this was an issue of debate within our firm between kind of the policy team and then between our chief economist and our director of fixed income, where it seemed like it would make sense for Biden to take out Powell and put his own person in. On the policy team, we kind of saw it a little bit differently, where Powell's basically taken Biden's mandate to prioritize employment over inflation. He's done everything he's asked. He wants to keep his job. So politically, it doesn't make a lot of sense to replace him. And I think, Secretary Yellen holds a lot of weight on this, her actually endorsing Powell being reappointed after she said that she wasn't really going to comment on it. I think that that's a big change. Potentially is that to give Powell more credence ahead of Jackson Hole, maybe, but I think she would have just stayed silent versus saying something, upfront about it if there was going to be a change on the horizon. I would say, again, for the Biden administration, there's going to be concern, especially in this current environment, about any changes that the Biden administration does to the Fed, about them politicizing the Fed. So if they were to take out Powell and they were to put in someone like Lael Brainerd or like Bostic, who would potentially take on more mandates to the Fed. So maybe they're going to take on climate as a mandate, which is a priority of the Biden administration. They're going to get accused of politicizing the Fed or putting in someone who's going to even more prioritize employment over inflation and potentially spook the markets. They can really achieve their goal with Powell still staying in because, again, he's taking their mandate. He's been criticized for not being aggressive enough on financial regulation. But they do have Quarles as vice chair. I don't want to call him a dead man walking, but certainly after Secretary or Senator Warren's comments towards him, his ability to get reappointed as vice chair after October looks much, much less. And they can put someone else like Lael Brainerd in as vice chair of supervision, and she'll be willing to do those climate stress tests on banks and kind of further that climate agenda without them having to put her into the chair position and risk some of that backlash of politicizing the Fed on that regard. And they also don't have to deal with the confirmation fight of getting 51 votes for that person. It avoids a political headache for them at a time where they really don't want a political headache. They also have an additional seat opening up in January, so they can put some more progressive in January as well. They have a lot of options, still keeping Powell in, and just it's easier for them if they keep Powell in, frankly. So our anticipation is they keep Powell in, they put someone progressive in as vice chair, and that person really takes on the regulatory climate agenda that the Biden administration wants to do with their whole of government approach.
Okay, thank you. I see we've already exceeded our time. I have no more questions. I don't know if there's maybe one more quick question from the rest of the crowd. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time today. It was incredibly informative. I think it's, really impactful and helpful for our advisors as they talk with their clients. So again, Courtney, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. And again, certainly no shortage of events, so feel free to reach out with any questions.
Great. Thanks again. I think that's all for today, folks. If you guys have any follow-up, just let me know. Thank you.